So, all right, hey guys, we're just going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing the last week in the gym. We're doing a full unit on Berimbolo and crab ride. So this last week was just turn that beeper off. So hey guys, we're doing a full couple of weeks on Berimbolo and crab ride as two systems that integrate really well into each other. So the last week was primarily focused on the wedge. The way we started looking at this was actually just working backwards from the wedge as the end goal of a Berimbolo, and then taking steps backwards, because I find when we're teaching this, it's often taught too quickly and you just dive straight into the whole movement, and there's so many moving pieces that it can be quite difficult and quite fragmented to put together. So we started working back from the wedge. We did this by, if Tarek is the head facing that way, perfect. My hips slightly higher than his, our knees up, and from here I'm chopping my knee back in towards his hip and then passing my leg over the back of this near side leg so that my knees are quite close together, and I'm back heeling and pulling my knees to my chest. From here I take my foot and stomp it to the ground. He's going to move his arm up and out of the way just for the sake of the drill. I stomp my foot to the ground as close to him as I can get it, and as close to my own butt as I can get it. And then I stomp the other foot down side by side with it to meet it. And you can see this starts to elevate his hips. When we have the gi, I can grab onto gi pants and use this to help control his posture, control his hips, and prevent him from slipping his hips back down to the mat. From this point, I have access to start climbing the back. I can grab, gi shoulder. Some people like to go for the collar. Obviously, in the no gi, we're working on grabbing hip and trap, like over the shoulder. And when I have access to the upper body, I'm also swapping my feet from inside to outside, and I can use that to attach to this truck hook. From here, I can straighten this leg and start climbing up the back, pulling in, getting my hooks. I'll do that the other way around. So, side by side, legs up, my knee is chopping back into his hip, my leg comes over the top, so I'm pulling my knee back to my chest, back heeling with both my feet, stomping it to the ground, and this starts to elevate his hips, and then when I stomp my other foot down to meet it, his hips get elevated. The other thing that I do here is I turn my hips away from him, here, which further elevates the hips. A lot of people make this mistake where we assume because we're attacking the back, I should immediately start turning in. But as I turn in, what happens to his hips? They immediately start dropping. And if his hips start dropping, he comes to the ground, I immediately start losing position. So, counterintuitively, chopping back, get my leg in position, step to the floor. Counterintuitively, I want to turn my hips away as I stomp my second foot down, which elevates his hips, and I can then get control of the hips and the upper body, swapping my legs, hip escaping and turning, and I'm ready to start cementing my position. So, one good way of thinking about the wedge as a position, if Tarek, you just go this way and move in a little bit. What I'm doing is very similar to what we do when we stack a person like this, get under the hips and start looking to pass. But we're doing that using our legs, not our arms. And the reason we call it the wedge is because I'm creating a wedge under his hips, then I'm using my other leg to spin him, fold him in half around the wedge that I've put there. So another common mistake that people make in this position is they get to here and start turning to their side even before they've done the stomp, and their leg is turning away and my knee is not pulling back into his hip, which means I have no wedge. So when I stomp this down, I get barely any elevation of the hips. And sometimes it's possible to finish a Berimbolo like this if your opponent has very bad Berimbolo defenses. So we want to be training assuming that we're facing somebody that knows what they're doing. And so for that, we need a really tight wedge in the hip, a good stomp, and turning our hips away, and that gets this elevation that I can utilize to start finishing the wedge. So that's our wedge. We'll do that from one more side, just side on. Fuck. I don't know when that came out.
Yeah, good question.
Okay, so as I was saying, we'll just do that from one more angle. So you can see it from that other angle. Fuck, Jesus, here we go. Fucking done a little switch, hip escape. Bam, taking the back, good stuff. Okay, so that's the wedge as an end position. The next thing to get used to is the idea of rolling over a shoulder, rolling over your opponent and being inverted. So if Tariq lies on his side the other way, all the way around. So what we're going to do from this position is the next idea that we introduced was the roll. I collect the second leg. Now, there's a few things that we'd do in a roll that might be slightly different to this, but initially we left those details out. We started off by having our opponent side on, and I pinch my knees either side of the top leg between my legs. From here, I'm already in position to wedge my hand at the hips and roll over that shoulder and turn, and I end up with his hips above this arm and in a tight wedge position. And I can then use the stuff that we've already talked about, the stomp, shift of the hips, then collecting the upper body grips, swapping over to my truck hook, spinning, and then collecting the back. So one more time. Okay, so I've got this top leg pinched between my two legs, and I'm just going to roll over, up and over into my wedge. I'm going to stomp my feet, get my other foot coming down to meet it. The hip elevation is already happening. If I need more, I can turn my hips further away, grab either my no-gi controls or something in fabric, swap my feet, hip escape, and look to start cementing the position. Finally, we looked at actually introducing the Berimbolo itself. So we'll do that from this position, starting from a double pull. The way you'll end up in a double pull might be two people sit down in front of each other wanting to play footsie, or perhaps I've executed a De La Riva sweep and got him down to a hip, and we've ended up in this position. Either way, the movement is as follows. I'm controlling the near side ankle, and I've got this De La Riva hook here, which I'm using initially to turn his leg away and open up space for me to initiate my roll. We trained this in the no-gi, but if you do have gi pants to hold on to, that can add to the control that you have. And obviously with our roll through, when I roll, I can look to grab belt. Some people prefer the shoulder control of the lapel. I'm going to teach this no-gi because that's how we worked on it during the week. But if you do have access to those gi grips, obviously that can add to your control during this movement. My opinion is that if you can do this in the no-gi, then the gi becomes a lot easier to execute the movement because the grips are a lot harder to strip in the gi for your opponent. So I'm grabbing this ankle, I'm twisting this leg, and what I'm aiming to do is as I roll, tucking my elbow tight, I'm going to look to get under his armpit and thread my foot across to this far hip, and I want to get under the armpit with this grip. As I'm doing that, my knee comes to his hip, and my foot, my laces of my boot, go to the other side of his hip. From here, I'm inverting and looking to roll, getting my knee deeper as I roll through to here, and if I can, reaching right through and grabbing his far hip. And from here, again, I've ended up in a nice wedge position where I can look hip, capture my grip, walk, and check the back. One of the most common mistakes that I see is people will roll through, but they'll have their elbow out in front of them, so they end up here, and it's really difficult to, without swinging your legs like a pendulum to get momentum, it's really difficult to get in close. So when you're dropping in for this Berimbolo, I recommend holding your elbow close to your hip so that when you land, it's almost behind you and you can use that as a wedge with this kind of movement to elevate your hips. So without doing the rest of the movement, this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. You can see my elbow flaring out onto the floor. So when I add the other details, reaching for the armpit, we end up doing this. And I get nice and deep into my control to elevate the hips and finish the movement. Second thing to think about is there's two different types of wedge, and we just looked at introducing the differences towards the end of the week. We've got our deep wedge and a shallow wedge. Usually when we're doing the Berimbolo at first, we're in a shallow wedge, and depending on our opponent's reactions, we'll move further through into the deep wedge, or we'll look to use the shallow wedge to finish the back take movement. So what I mean by this is I roll through, and I'm here. This is quite shallow. My knee is not deep across the body, in between the legs, ready to roll under. It's here. If I feel like Tarek's starting to fall back onto his back, so he's not basing on his hands, I'm definitely shooting deep, and I'm ready to start stomping and finishing the bolo. If I can feel that he's basing on his hands and I can't get that rotation, I'm more likely to stay in a shallow wedge position. Partly because if I stay deep, it introduces greater risk of him re-boloing and counter back taking me, and I obviously don't want that. And also I can use the shallow wedge to elevate him and get this kind of slingshot motion, throwing him in between my hips and changing the type of back take that I'm doing. And that looks a little bit like this. To my shallow wedge here, I feel like I'm not going to be able to get the roll through, so I swap my grips to his far leg, and I've got my other hand deep on the hip, which I have easy access to because he's basing up on his hands. From here, I pinch into his hip with my knee, flaring my foot out into his chest, and this bite just below the knee allows me to elevate his hips and throw him in between my legs, finish with this kind of slingshot bolo. So one more time. Don't feel like I can get all the way through. So pinch, flare, and catapult him into the back. Next, we looked at a couple of other common entries. So we've got our double pull, we've looked at our De La Riva sweep, and we looked at our side control roll through. In addition to that, this commonly comes up in response to leg entanglements. So let's say Tarek has a single leg X here. There's two possible ways I could do it from this position. One is pushing this foot down across, getting my knee line safe, back stepping, and when I get to here, you'll notice that I'm in exactly the position that we talked about for our side control roll. To get my wedge here, and take the back. Fluidly, that'll look like this. Right. The other direction I can take in that same position is looking to beat the knee once I strip this and rolling through into a wedge this way. So get this out of the way, turn, and I can back step here. Also lands me in a wedge that I can use to take the back. Another common example is if Tarek has me in a saddle. I can look to pressure in on this leg. I'm hiding my heel, turning, ignore the fact that we're wearing gis, turning around, getting my knee line safe, sitting back if I need to create this pressure so he can't suck my knee back through, back step, and we're straight back into our wedge, ready to take back. How we kind of wrapped all this together, we looked at all these ideas, was explaining that the Berimbolo is actually a mixed bag in terms of how successful it is, because defending the Berimbolo tends not to be that difficult a task. If I am looking to Berimbolo on Tarek, and I've done everything right, if he just looks to block this top leg while I'm looking to roll through, all of a sudden I can't get into his hips, so I don't have the access to start initiating that roll through. And there's a few different ways that we can deal with this, but what we're going to look at over the next week is moving into crab ride. And we'll see some of the other ways to get into crab ride as a position itself, but we'll start from a failed Berimbolo. So I come up, I can't get in, so I'm going to invert under this leg, and I'm in a position to start inserting my crab hooks and looking to take the back from there. So hopefully that's some useful information, guys. It's quite a lot, but enjoy and tune in next week for a little bit of crab ride magic. Thank you, Tarek, for the help. Perfect. Fuck yeah, cover up. Berimbolo. Yep, and spin around so your head's facing the other way. We'll train today Berimbolo. Berimbolo. Yeah, there, and then like come across this way. Berimbolo. Okay, guys, huge honor from me. I'm here with my friend Tarek. These technical difficulties are brought to you by Kermit the Frog. Che.